She had nothing, no family, no home, no name worth remembering. At least that's what they told her. The day Abigail Rowan walked into Iron Ridge, Montana, the men laughed, the women whispered, and a powerful cattle baron was already sharpening his knives to destroy everything in that valley. But nobody warned him about her. Nobody told Roland Mercer that the most dangerous weapon on the frontier wasn't a rifle or a legal document. It was a woman with flour on her hands, fire in her eyes, and absolutely nothing left to lose. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far one woman's courage can travel. The ground was still frozen when they put her uncle in it. There was no preacher. There was no congregation dressed in solemn black, no flowers laid across the mound, no hymn carried on the cold Montana wind. There was only Abigail Rowan, standing alone at the edge of a shallow grave she had dug herself with a rusted shovel and two blistered hands, staring down at the pine box that held the last person on earth who had ever spoken her name with any kind of tenderness. It had taken her 3 hours to break through the frozen crust of the earth. 3 hours in the gray pre-dawn, her breath coming out in clouds, her back screaming with each strike of the blade. She hadn't cried. Not because she didn't feel it, she felt it so deeply it had turned to stone somewhere behind her ribs, but because there was simply no one there to cry to. Uncle Cray had been a quiet man, a baker by trade, a dreamer by nature, a man who believed that the right combination of butter and patience could fix most of what ailed the human heart. He'd raised Abigail from the age of 7 after her parents died of fever, and he had taught her everything he knew. How to read the temperature of a cast iron pan by holding your palm 2 inches above the surface. How to coax a stubborn sourdough into rising with nothing but warmth and time. How to taste the difference between sorrow and sweetness, and how to bake something that carried both at once. He had also taught her, without ever saying it aloud, that kindness was a choice, not a reward you earned after the world had been kind to you first. She had watched him be kind to people who gave him nothing in return his entire life. She had watched him smile at the men who refused to pay their tab, forgive the neighbors who borrowed and never returned, and press extra rolls into the hands of families who couldn't afford the ones they'd already taken. He died with almost nothing. A 2-room cabin outside of Hargrove Falls, a collection of handwritten recipes so stained with years of use that some of the words had nearly disappeared, and exactly $31 hidden in the bottom of a flour tin. Abigail found the money when she was cleaning out the kitchen. She stood there for a long moment holding those worn bills and a few coins, and she did the math quietly in her head. $31. Enough to survive for, what, a week? 2, if she was careful and desperate, which she was both. She took the cookbook. She took the old tin pie pan, dented on one side from the time Uncle Cray had dropped it off the porch in the winter of her 9th year, and laughed so hard he'd cried. She took the $31, and she took whatever she could carry in a canvas bag that had once belonged to her mother. Then she walked away from the only home she had ever known, toward a horizon she couldn't see clearly, into a Montana winter that did not care about her grief or her hunger or the weight she carried, both on her back and somewhere deeper. The town of Millhaven was about 14 miles east of the cabin, and Abigail reached it by mid-afternoon. She had heard there might be work there, work of any kind, laundry, mending, kitchen help, cleaning. She was not proud about what the work was. Pride, she had long decided, was a luxury that people with options could afford. She had exactly one option: find something or starve. The math was simple enough. What she hadn't counted on was the way the town looked at her the moment she stepped through the main gate. Millhaven was the kind of frontier settlement that had grown fast and mean, the way weeds do when there's been too much sun and not enough rain. It had 3 saloons, a dry goods store, a land office, a post stop, and the particular brand of smallness that afflicts people who have planted themselves in the middle of nowhere and decided, in the absence of anything more interesting, to make the passing judgment of strangers their primary entertainment. Abigail was a large woman. She knew this. She had known it since childhood, since the first time a classmate in the one-room schoolhouse had sniggered something cruel about the size of her hips, since the first time a storekeeper had looked her up and down with barely concealed contempt before answering her question. She had learned, over 28 years of being in this body, to absorb those looks the way a thick-barked tree absorbs cold, letting it touch the surface, refusing to let it reach the center. But Millhaven looked at her with a particular brand of cruelty that still managed to find the gaps. She had barely made it past the front hitching post before she heard the first comment, a man's voice, lazy and amused, calling from the porch of the nearest saloon. "Lord Almighty, what is that heading toward us?" Laughter, low and rolling, like rocks kicked down a hill. She kept walking, eyes forward, chin level. "You lost, sweetheart?" A second voice now, younger, wanting to impress. "The cattle pen's back that-a-way." More laughter. A woman on the opposite boardwalk looked up, saw what was happening, and immediately looked away. Not out of indifference, Abigail thought, but out of the very specific cowardice of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had decided it wasn't her problem. Abigail stopped in front of the dry goods store where a handwritten notice had been pinned to the doorframe. She read it carefully. Cook needed. Iron Ridge Ranch, 9 miles north. Wages paid monthly. Ask for Silas Hawthorne at the land office. She read it twice. Then she turned and walked to the land office. The man behind the counter looked up when she entered. He was thin and weathered, with the expression of someone who had been doing paperwork for too long in a room with not enough light. He looked at her. He looked at the notice she'd pulled from the doorframe, and something crossed his face, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, gone too quickly to catch. "You're here about the cook position," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He studied her for a moment longer than was necessary. "You know anything about ranch cooking? We're talking 20-plus men at a table, not a Sunday supper." "I've been cooking since I was 7 years old," Abigail said. "I can feed 20 men or 200. I can work a wood stove or an open fire pit. I can plan provisions, manage a kitchen budget, and I don't waste and I don't steal." She paused. "I also make a very good pie." The man behind the counter looked at her for another long beat. Then he sighed. The sigh of a man who has already tried and failed at something he'd rather not repeat, and wrote an address on a scrap of paper. "Hawthorne's expecting someone by end of week," he said. "You can ride out with the supply wagon tomorrow morning, 6 sharp. Don't be late." "I won't be," she said. She wasn't. The ride to Iron Ridge took most of the morning. The supply wagon was driven by a squat, weather-cracked man named Pell, who had approximately 3 things to say and said them all within the first mile, then lapsed into a silence that Abigail found completely acceptable. She sat in the back among flour sacks and canned goods and watched Montana pass by in all its enormous, indifferent beauty. The mountains blue and heavy with snow in the distance, the plains stretching out pale gold and frozen beneath a sky so wide it seemed to press down like a hand. She thought about Uncle Cray. She thought about his hands, how large they were, how they always smelled faintly of yeast and cinnamon even in winter. She thought about the way he used to say, whenever she was afraid of something, "The bread doesn't know it's going to rise, it just rises anyway." She had never been entirely sure what he meant by that, but she had carried the words with her for 20 years anyway, the way you carry something whose meaning you haven't yet grown into. Iron Ridge Ranch appeared around a bend in the frost-hardened road, like something that had been planted there by someone who meant it to last. A main house built of dark timber and riverstone, flanked by long bunkhouses, a smithy, a barn large enough to shelter a small village, and a web of corrals stretching out to the south. It was impressive in scale and deeply, visibly exhausted. The fences needed mending. Several roof shingles were missing from the bunkhouse. The yard between the main house and the barn was churned to mud and then frozen solid in the shape of chaos, as if the last time anyone had paid close attention to it was some months ago. And since then, things had simply continued happening without being addressed. Abigail noted all of this without judgment. She had learned from years in her uncle's kitchen that disorder was rarely the result of carelessness. It was almost always the result of a person or a household simply having too much to carry. Pell pulled the wagon to a stop by the side door of the main house. "Someone will come out," he said. Then he climbed down and began unloading sacks as if she no longer existed. She waited. The door opened after a minute and a man stepped out. Silas Hawthorne was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall and lean in the manner of a man who worked hard and slept too little. The kind of lean that isn't elegant but purposeful, built by years of doing rather than choosing. His dark hair had silver at the temples, and his face had the kind of lines that come from weather and loss rather than age alone. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at the horizon. Not with hope, exactly, but with the habit of looking, even when there was nothing there. He was, she noticed, younger than he looked. Maybe 35, maybe less. But grief, she knew, aged a person in ways that had nothing to do with years. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Miss Rowan?" he said finally. "Yes," she said. Another pause. She watched him arrange something in his face. Whatever had been there in that first unguarded second, he set it aside and replaced it with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to manage his own reactions. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen was large and cold. The stove was a 6-burner cast-iron giant that needed cleaning but was otherwise sound. The pantry was stocked better than she'd expected, though organized in the particular way of a household where multiple different people had tried to maintain order and none of them had agreed on a system. Pots hung from iron hooks above the work counter. The floor was swept but not scrubbed. The window above the sink looked out toward the barn. Abigail walked through it slowly, opening the pantry door, lifting the lid of the flour bin, turning the tap to check the water pressure. Silas Hawthorne stood in the doorway, watching her the way a man watches someone assess damage he has been living with for so long he stopped seeing it. "When did you last have a regular cook?" she asked. 8 months ago, he said. "She left when her son took ill in Billings. Before her, the foreman's wife did it. Before that—" He stopped. "My wife cooked." The past tense sat in the room like furniture. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. She meant it simply, without decoration. "The work is hard," Silas said, as if redirecting them both. 22 men at breakfast, usually the same at supper. Lunch is packed and taken out to the fields. I need someone who can manage provisions and not run me over budget. I can't—" He paused, and something tightened briefly around his eyes. "The ranch is going through a difficult period, financially. I understand. Do you have references? My uncle was Oliver Cray out of Hargrove Falls. He ran Cray's Bakery there for 22 years. He passed recently. I've been keeping his kitchen since I was 12 years old." She hesitated. "I don't have letters. He's gone, and the bakery's gone, and I don't have much of anything except what I can do with my hands. But I'm asking you to let me show you that." Silas Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Supper's at 6. There's 22 men expecting something hot. The pantry's what it is. Can you work with what's there?" "Yes," she said. "Then you start now," he said, and walked away. She fed 22 men at 6 o'clock that evening. She made a beef and root vegetable stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Skillet cornbread baked in 4 cast-iron pans simultaneously. Pickled beets from the back of the pantry that she'd found behind 3 cans of questionable peaches, and a blackberry cobbler from dried berries and the last of a jar of sugar she'd located on the highest shelf, behind a rusted tin that had given up its original purpose long ago. The men came in loud and left quiet, which, in Abigail's experience, was the best possible review a kitchen could receive. She was cleaning the last pot when the door pushed open and 2 figures appeared, one bold, one hesitant, like a punctuation mark followed by a question. The older one was maybe 12, with her father's dark eyes and a jaw set at an angle that suggested she had already decided how she felt about things before they happened. The younger one was perhaps 8, slight and watchful, clutching the doorframe as if considering the option of running. "You're the new cook," the older one said. Not a question, an assessment. "I am," Abigail said. She kept scrubbing the pot. "You must be Hazel." The girl's eyes sharpened. "How do you know my name?" "Your father mentioned you when he showed me the kitchen. He said I should ask Hazel if I needed to know where anything was kept, because Hazel knew this house better than anyone." This was approximately true. Silas Hawthorne had said something close to this, in a sideways sort of fashion, while pointing at the pantry. Hazel's chin lifted slightly. "He said that?" "Something like it," Abigail said. She set the pot down and looked toward the smaller figure still gripping the doorframe. "And you must be Molly." The smaller girl didn't speak. She just watched with enormous dark eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once: the stove, the clean counter, the cobbler pan, and Abigail herself. Cataloging it all with the careful attention of a child who has learned to study changes in her environment because changes have not historically been safe. "She doesn't talk much to strangers," Hazel said, The protective weight in her voice was unmistakable. 12 years old and already standing guard. "That's all right," Abigail said. She turned back to the counter and began drying the pot. "I don't require conversation. I just make food." There was a silence. Then, very quietly, from the doorframe, "Is there any cobbler left?" Abigail turned. Molly was looking at the pan on the back of the stove with an expression of barely contained longing. "There is," Abigail said. "Would you like some?" The smallest nod, almost invisible. Abigail cut 2 generous portions. She put them on the cleanest plates she could find, set them on the kitchen table, and went back to putting away the dried pots without making a production of it. After a moment, she heard the shuffle of small boots on the floor, and then the scrape of chairs. She kept her back to them while they ate. She didn't hover. She didn't ask them questions. She simply moved around the kitchen, finishing the work of putting things in order, and let the sound of 2 spoons against 2 plates be the only conversation necessary. When they left, Hazel saying nothing, Molly glancing back once from the doorway, the kitchen felt for the first time like it might have a pulse. Later, when the ranch had gone quiet, and the only sounds were the wind off the mountains and the distant settling of the barn, Abigail sat alone at the kitchen table with her uncle's cookbook open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. She was thinking about what she had noticed. She had noticed the loose board on the second porch step that Hazel stepped over without thinking, which meant it had been loose for a long time. She had noticed the way Silas Hawthorne had hesitated at the mention of the kitchen budget. Not the hesitation of a careful man, but of a man who had looked at numbers recently and hadn't liked what he'd seen. She had noticed the photograph on the mantel in the main room, glimpsed through the half-open door. A woman with dark hair and an expression of cheerful defiance, her arms around 2 smaller versions of the girls who had just eaten her cobbler. She had noticed that the greatest hunger in this house had nothing to do with food. Outside, the Montana wind pressed against the window glass. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but they were there, enormous and patient and indifferent to everything beneath them. Abigail Rowan pressed her palm flat against the cover of her uncle's cookbook. She thought, "The bread doesn't know it's going to rise." Then she put out the lamp and let the ranch settle into silence around her and slept the deep and dreamless sleep of someone who has finally arrived somewhere, even if she doesn't yet know what that somewhere means. She had been at Iron Ridge for 4 days when she first heard the name Roland Mercer. She heard it the way you hear thunder before a storm, in pieces, at a distance, carried on other people's voices. The ranch hand spoke it low, the way men spoke about things they were worried about but hadn't yet decided how to address. She caught it over the breakfast table on the 3rd morning. Mercer's men were at the west fence again. And again that evening, passed between 2 older hands in the yard with the tight, abbreviated language of people who had already said everything there was to say about a subject and were now simply monitoring it. She didn't ask questions. She had learned in enough hard rooms that the best way to understand a place was to listen before you spoke, to let the shape of a thing reveal itself before you tried to name it. But on the 4th day, she was crossing the yard toward the smokehouse when she nearly walked into Silas Hawthorne coming around the corner of the barn at speed, his jaw set and his eyes carrying something that had moved well past worry into the darker territory beyond it. He stopped when he saw her. For a fraction of a second, the guard came down, just long enough for her to see that he was exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Then the guard went back up. "Miss Rowan?" he said, crisp, contained. "Mr. Hawthorne." She paused. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," he said. The word was too fast and too flat to be true. "Everything's fine." He walked past her toward the main house. She watched him go. The set of his shoulders, the particular tightness across his back that she recognized as the posture of a man trying to hold something together through the simple discipline of his own spine. She turned back toward the smokehouse. She was beginning to understand that fine, at Iron Ridge Ranch, meant something very different from fine everywhere else. And she was beginning to understand with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read kitchens and the people who inhabited them, that this household was in far more danger than it knew. She didn't know yet what she was walking into. She only knew she had walked into enough cold rooms to understand one thing. The only way out was through, and the only tool she'd ever had was the same one she'd carried across 14 miles of frozen Montana frontier. Flour, patience, and the particular stubborn refusal to leave a table empty. It would have to be enough. The name Roland Mercer came into full focus on a Tuesday. Abigail had been at Iron Ridge for 11 days when she overheard the conversation that changed everything. Not because she was eavesdropping, but because the walls of the main house were built for Montana winters, not for privacy, and the voices coming from Silas Hawthorne's study carried through the plank wall beside the kitchen hearth with uncomfortable clarity. She was rolling pie dough at the time. She kept rolling. "He's not going to wait forever, Silas." The voice belonged to Garrett Cole, the ranch foreman, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a gray-streaked beard and the measured patience of someone who had delivered bad news before and knew exactly how much weight it carried. "Mercer's been buying up water claims from here to the Blackfoot River for the last 2 years. He gets Iron Ridge's rights, and he controls the whole northern corridor. I know what he gets." Silas's voice was quiet. That particular quietness Abigail had already learned to read. Not calm, but compressed. A man pushing something down so it didn't surface. "The debt note comes due in April," Garrett said. "If the spring herd doesn't bring what we need at market—" "I know when the note comes due, Garrett." "Due, Garrett." A silence. Then Garrett again, slower this time, as if measuring each word. "He's been talking to Evelyn, having her over for supper at the Mercer house. His daughter." Another silence. Longer. "I've heard," Silas said, "people are saying he's positioning her, that if you can't pay the note, he'll offer to forgive the debt in exchange for—" "I know what he'll offer." The conversation stopped there, as if both men had looked at the edge of something and agreed, without speaking, not to step any closer to it tonight. Abigail rolled the dough thinner. She said nothing. She filed everything she had heard into the careful, organized cabinet in her mind where she stored the things she didn't yet know what to do with, and she finished the pie, and she put it in the oven, and she started on supper. But her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She had come to Iron Ridge carrying nothing but the contents of a canvas bag and the specific intention of surviving. She had not come to inherit someone else's trouble. She had enough of her own. And yet, as she stood at the stove listening to the fire talk inside the iron belly of it, she felt the particular pull of a thing she recognized. Not obligation exactly. Something older. The same thing that had made Uncle Cray press extra rolls into the hands of families who couldn't afford them, that had made him stay open on the coldest nights when he knew someone might need a warm place to sit. The understanding that some fights, once you could see them clearly, became yours whether you'd asked for them or not. She put the feeling aside. There was supper to make. She made chicken and dumplings from a hen Pell had brought in that morning, corn pudding from the last of the dry goods, and biscuits in 3 cast-iron pans stacked in rotation through the oven. When the men came in from the fields cold-handed and red-faced from the wind, the kitchen smelled like something a person might describe later and privately as the specific opposite of loneliness. She watched them eat. She watched how they settled. Not just the loosening of tired shoulders, but something less physical. Something in the quality of the silence they ate in. It wasn't the silence of exhausted men too tired to speak. It was the silence of men who were, for 20 minutes, simply present somewhere warm. She had fed enough people to know the difference. Hazel appeared in the doorway at the tail end of supper, when most of the hands had filed back out and only a few remained finishing their coffee. She stood in her particular way, straight-backed, arms loosely crossed, projecting the calibrated indifference of a girl who wanted to observe without being observed. "There's extra," Abigail said, without turning around. The sound of a chair being pulled out. Hazel sat at the far end of the table, away from the remaining ranch hands, and ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had been skipping regular meals and didn't want to make a thing of it. Abigail brought her a biscuit without being asked. Hazel looked at it, then at Abigail. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "No," Abigail agreed pleasantly. "You're a 12-year-old girl who's been feeding herself and her sister on whatever was left after 22 men got through a kitchen. That's not charity. That's a mathematical problem, and I'm solving it." Hazel stared at her for a moment. Something moved across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of a recalculation. "Molly likes the cobbler better than the dumplings," she said finally, in case you wanted to know. "I did want to know," Abigail said. "Thank you." Hazel picked up the biscuit. It wasn't friendship yet. It was something more preliminary. Two people in the same space deciding, independently, that they might not be opposed to being in the same space. But Abigail had learned from years in a kitchen that most things worth having started with something much smaller than you'd expect. The weeks that followed moved in the particular rhythm of hard work. Early mornings in the cold kitchen, the stove lit before the sky was light, the long days of feeding and planning and stretching provisions in ways that required more creativity than she'd ever had to apply in her uncle's well-stocked bakery. She learned the men's appetites, their preferences, the ones who needed coffee before they could form a sentence, and the ones who came to the kitchen door in the afternoons hoping, without asking, for something to hold them until supper. She learned that Denny Potts, one of the younger hands, had a birthday in February that nobody seemed to have remembered for at least 2 years running. She made him a cake. He looked at it like a man encountering evidence of a world he'd half convinced himself no longer existed. She learned that the foreman, Garrett Cole, took his supper a little later than the others and liked to sit at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes afterward with his coffee. Not out of unfriendliness, but out of the need for a pocket of quiet in an otherwise loud day. She let him have it, moving around him without disturbing it, refilling his cup without making it a conversation. He started talking to her after the 3rd week, in the way that people talk when they've been watched without judgment for long enough to believe it might be safe. "You're not what I expected," he said one evening, apropos of nothing. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone who'd last 3 days and go running back to wherever the wagon brought her from." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The last 4 didn't make it past a week." "I don't have anywhere to go back to," she said, simply, without self-pity. Garrett looked at her for a moment. "I'm sorry for that," he said, and she could tell that he was in the plain, uncomplicated way of a man who said what he meant and didn't reach for ornament. "The ranch is worth staying for," she said, and she meant that too. He looked out the kitchen window, toward the dark yard and the darker barn beyond it. "It was once," he said. "It could be again." A pause. "Silas is a good man. He's got a lot pressing on him right now. Things that aren't his fault, but that he blames himself for anyway." She didn't ask for more. She had learned that Garrett Cole, like most people, would give you what he was ready to give without being pushed, and that the fastest way to stop someone from talking was to look too eager for them to continue. He did continue after another long pull of coffee. "Roland Mercer's been a problem for this valley for 15 years. He came in with Eastern money and a land office connection, and he's been squeezing people out one by one ever since. What he can't buy, he buries in legal paperwork. What he can't bury, he poisons with rumor." Garrett set the cup down. "He's been working on Silas for 2 years, waiting for the right moment." "And this is the right moment?" she said. "Spring debt note, bad last season. 2 wet summers in a row cutting the herd returns." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself as much as to her. "Yeah, this is the moment." She thought about that for a while after he left. She thought about the photograph on the mantel, the dark-haired woman with the defiant smile, and about Molly watching from the doorframe, and about Hazel's carefully held indifference that was really just love wearing armor. She thought about Silas Hawthorne's compressed silences and the silver in his hair that had probably come in faster than it should have. She went back to her uncle's cookbook that night and found what she was looking for, a pie recipe in the back pages that he'd written in smaller letters than his usual hand, as if it were a private notation rather than an instruction. Beside it, in different ink, older ink, faded nearly to invisibility, were the words he must have added later. "For when things are hard, everything is better with this one." She had made the pie exactly once before, during the worst winter after her parents died, when she and Uncle Cray had sat together in the bakery after closing and eaten it in silence. She hadn't made it since. She made it the next morning, left it on the kitchen table without ceremony, without announcement, without explanation. Silas Hawthorne came in from the yard at mid-morning for coffee and stopped when he saw it. He stood very still for a moment, looking at it the way people look at things that have surprised them into feeling something before they had time to decide whether to feel it. He didn't say anything. He cut a piece, stood at the counter, and ate it with the kind of concentration that had nothing to do with the taste and everything to do with something else, something being very carefully not named. He washed his plate, dried it, put it away. "That's a good pie, Miss Rowan," he said, without turning around. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne," she said. He put on his coat and went back outside, but something had shifted barely perceptibly in the way the house felt around her. as if a window somewhere had been opened just a fraction. It was 3 days later that Molly Hawthorne came to the kitchen doorway at 7:30 in the morning and stood there in her nightgown and said, in the particular voice of a child who has been working up the courage to say something for longer than she should have had to, "Can I watch you?" Abigail was making bread. She looked at the small, serious face in the doorway, and she said, "You can do more than watch. You can help if you'd like." Molly came in. She sat at the end of the kitchen counter where Abigail made space for her, and Abigail put a piece of dough in front of her and showed her how to press the heels of her hands into it. Slow, firm, rhythmic. And for a while the kitchen held nothing but the sound of 2 pairs of hands working the same substance, one patient and practiced, and one small and earnest and learning. After a long time, Molly said, "My mama used to make bread." Abigail kept her hands moving. "What kind?" she asked. "Easy, unhurried. The kind with honey in it. It was yellow." A pause. "She's been gone for 2 years." "I know," Abigail said. "I'm sorry you lost her." Another long silence. The dough turned slowly under small hands. "Do you think she would be sad," Molly said carefully, "if someone else cooked in her kitchen?" Abigail stopped and looked at the little girl beside her, just seeing, really looked at her, the whole weight of what was being asked quietly visible in the serious dark eyes watching her back. "I think," Abigail said just as carefully, "that a woman who made honey bread for her daughters would be happy knowing her kitchen was warm and her daughters were fed." She paused. "And I think she would be very proud of a girl brave enough to ask that question." Molly looked down at the dough. She pressed her palms into it once, twice. "Okay," she said quietly. "Just that. Okay." But it settled in the room like something being put down, set down, not dropped. With the deliberateness of a child deciding to trust something, someone, the way you choose to trust a door you haven't opened yet. Hazel appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, ostensibly looking for her boots, and found her sister at the counter beside Abigail with flour on both hands and something approaching peace on her face. Hazel stood in the doorway for a long moment, and whatever she saw made the armor shift, just slightly, just enough. "Is there room for one more?" she said, flat, casual, as if she didn't care about the answer. "There's always room," Abigail said. Hazel came in, pushed her sleeves up, and put her hands in the dough without ceremony, as if she'd been doing it all along. The bread they made that morning was lopsided and imperfect, and absolutely the best thing Abigail had eaten in months. She made sure each of them knew it. The laughter was small when it came, startled out of Molly by a cloud of flour that missed the bowl, growing into something that pulled Hazel in despite herself, and then folding Abigail into it too, the 3 of them in a warm kitchen on a cold Montana morning, making a noise that the house had not heard in a very long time. She heard Silas's boots stop outside the kitchen door. She didn't look up. Neither did the girls. But she heard the pause there, long enough to be deliberate, and then the slow creak of a man leaning against a door frame, not entering, just listening, just taking in the sound of it, just standing in the radius of it, because it had been 2 years since this house had made that sound. And even standing at the edge of it was better than not being near it at all. After a moment, his boots moved on, but slower than before. The spring came on gradually, the way it always did in Montana. 1 foot in winter, 1 foot in something that wasn't quite yet warmth, the ground uncertain beneath it. And with the spring came the rumors, carried on the mouths of every passing rider and supply wagon and traveler who stopped at the Millhaven post office on their way through. People said Roland Mercer had hired lawyers from as far as Helena. People said he had documents, old documents, concerning original water rights filings going back 20 years, that could complicate Iron Ridge's claim to the creek that fed half its pasture through the dry summer months. People said his daughter Cecilia had been seen in Millhaven twice in the past month, dressed carefully, sitting in the land office with her father for long meetings that nobody was invited to and everybody heard about. People said Silas Hawthorne was running out of time. The people Abigail noted were happy to discuss all of this at considerable length and no personal cost. The distance between watching someone drown and pulling them out was, in Millhaven, apparently a comfortable one. She heard the latest round of it from Nell Prater, the wife of a neighboring homesteader who came to the ranch on a Wednesday to return a borrowed harness and stayed for coffee. and who delivered the latest gossip with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had not yet considered what it might feel like to be the subject of it.
"They're saying he'll have no choice by July," Nell told her, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup Abigail had put in front of her. "Either pay the note or agree to Mercer's terms. And everyone knows he can't pay the note." She shook her head with the sympathetic briskness of the uninvested. "Shame, really. Such a nice family." "Yes," said Abigail. She refilled the coffee without comment.
After Nell left, she stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking out at the yard where Silas was working with two hands on a section of fence that needed replacing, his movements precise and steady in the late afternoon light. He worked the way he did everything, quietly, without waste, with the focused economy of a man who had no energy to spare for anything that wasn't essential. She watched the set of his shoulders. She watched the way he paused sometimes, between post and wire, and looked out toward the mountains with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head that wasn't coming out right. He had been doing that arithmetic for a long time, she thought, and he had been doing it alone. She turned back to the kitchen. She had already been thinking quietly for several weeks. The way she thought about most things, carefully and without announcement. She had been thinking about the pie orders that had come in sideways, accidentally. Nell Prater asking if Abigail ever sold them because her husband couldn't stop talking about the one she'd sent home with her last visit. One of the ranch hands mentioning that his sister in Millhaven had asked who made the pie that came with the provisions order last month. She had been thinking about her uncle's recipe book and the $31 in the flour tin and the difference between a person who arrived somewhere and a person who put down roots. She pulled out a sheet of paper. She sat at the kitchen table with a pen and wrote down 3 things: what she could make, what it would cost, what it might earn. The numbers were small, but they were not nothing. She folded the paper and set it beside the stove. There was supper to make first. There was always supper to make first. But after supper, she decided, she was going to knock on the door of Silas Hawthorne's study and say the words she had been arranging in her mind for 2 weeks. She was going to tell him that he didn't have to fight alone anymore. She was going to tell him she had an idea, and she was going to let him decide what to do with it, because she had learned from enough hard rooms and enough stubborn people that you couldn't give someone courage from the outside. You could only build the kind of table where courage had enough room to find its own feet. She put the supper on. She let the kitchen fill with warmth and the smell of something good. And she waited for the right moment, the way her uncle had taught her, the way bread always teaches you, not by forcing it, but by being ready when it comes. She knocked on the study door that same evening, after supper had been cleared and the kitchen restored to order and the girls put to bed. Molly with a small piece of leftover bread tucked beside her pillow like a talisman. Hazel with a book, and the particular performance of someone who intended to read all night and would be asleep within 10 minutes. Silas called for her to come in, and she did, standing in the doorway of his study with the folded piece of paper in her hand and the calm expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment enough to know that rehearsing it further wouldn't help. The study was a room that told the truth about its owner. There were papers everywhere, organized but densely so, the way a man's desk looks when he's been managing too many things for too long without adequate help. A lamp burned low on the corner of the desk. The photograph from the mantel was echoed here by a smaller one, set at an angle that suggested it had been moved and replaced many times, always coming back to approximately the same position. Silas looked up from whatever he'd been reading. He looked tired in the bone-deep way that sleep didn't fix, but his eyes, when they met hers, were fully present. "Miss Rowan," he said. "I won't take much of your time," she said, and crossed the room and put the folded paper on the desk in front of him. "I want to propose something. I've written it down because I think it's easier to argue with a piece of paper than with a person, and I'd like you to have the chance to think before you respond." He looked at the paper, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He unfolded the paper and read it. She watched his face while he did, the way she watched bread in the oven. Not impatiently, but with the specific attention of someone who knows that what happens next will tell them something important. His expression moved through several things: surprise, then something more careful, then what she tentatively identified as the expression a person gets when an idea arrives that they hadn't considered and can immediately see the shape of. He set the paper down. "You want to sell pies," he said. "Not just pies. Preserves. Bread. Cured goods, when the season permits. I want to establish a regular supply to Millhaven and the 3 settlements east of here, through the same wagon line that brings our provisions. Small at first. Scaled up as we find the demand." She paused. "The startup cost is low. The margin on baked goods, done at scale in an already running kitchen, is better than most people realize. It won't save the ranch alone, but it could be part of what does." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the paper again. "Why are you doing this?" he said. And the way he asked it was not suspicious. It was genuinely curious, with an undertone of something more private, as if the question had been waiting under other questions for a while. "Because the ranch is worth saving," she said, "and because your daughters have started to laugh again, and I would like that to continue." He was very still for a moment. "That's a straightforward answer," he said. "I find straightforward answers are usually the true ones." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessing look he'd given her that first day in the kitchen, but something different. Something that was trying to understand something it hadn't expected to need to understand. "All right," he said finally. "Show me the numbers again." They spent an hour at his desk. She showed him what she had. He pushed back on 2 points and was right about both of them. She revised the figures on the spot, in the margins of her own paper, and he watched her do it with an expression that had moved, almost without his permission, into something close to respect. "We start small," he said, when they'd finished. "1 wagon run. See what comes back." "That's all I'm asking," she said. She stood to leave. She was almost to the door when he said her name. Just that. Not a question. Not a request. Just the word itself. She turned. He was looking at the paper on his desk. He didn't look up. "Thank you," he said. For the pie, too, the other morning." She understood that he meant more than the pie. She understood that exactly. "You're welcome, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, and left him to his papers and his lamp and the photograph that always found its way back to the same angle on his desk. The first wagon run went out 2 weeks later with 4 pies, 6 loaves, and 2 jars of blackberry preserves. It came back with empty crates and 3 advance orders for the following week. Abigail said nothing about this to anyone except Garrett, who received the news with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to see something go right. "Word travels fast out here," he said. "Hunger travels faster," she said. By the end of April, the kitchen was running a morning production alongside the regular ranch cooking that required Abigail to be up an hour before she had been, which meant she was rising before 4 to have everything ready by 6. She didn't mention this to anyone. She simply adjusted. It was Hazel who noticed first. She appeared in the kitchen one morning at 4:15, fully dressed, her dark hair pulled back with the particular seriousness of a girl who had made a decision. She took her position at the end of the counter without asking or explaining, and began measuring flour into the largest bowl with the focused competence of someone who had been paying close attention for weeks and was now ready to demonstrate it. Abigail looked at her. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," said Hazel, and kept measuring. Molly came 15 minutes later, still half asleep, and took up her own position without ceremony. The 3 of them worked in the blue pre-dawn dark with the lamp burning low and the stove ticking with heat, and if anyone watching from the yard had looked through the kitchen window at that hour, they would have seen something that looked from the outside unmistakably like a family at work. It was the first week of May when the sky changed. Abigail was in the yard hanging the kitchen linens when she smelled it, faint at first, the way danger usually arrives, at the very edge of the senses, easy to dismiss if you were inclined to dismiss things. She wasn't. She stood very still and lifted her face to the wind and identified what she was smelling. Smoke. But not the clean smoke of a cook fire or a chimney. The other kind. The wide, wild, uncontrolled kind that carried something underneath it. Something that made the back of the neck go cold regardless of the temperature. She looked north. The sky above the ridgeline was wrong. It had a color that didn't belong, a bruised orange-gray that sat too low and spread too fast, boiling up from behind the hills with the particular urgency of something that had already made up its mind. Garrett was crossing the yard at a run before she could say anything. "Fire on the north ridge," he said already past her. "Silas, get Silas." The next 20 minutes dissolved into controlled chaos. Silas came out of the barn at a run, met Garrett halfway across the yard, and what passed between them was brief and functional. The communication of men who had worked together long enough to compress everything non-essential. Within 15 minutes, every able-bodied hand on the property was mounted or moving, fire lines being called, water barrels being loaded onto the utility wagon, the foreman's voice cutting through the noise with the authority of long practice. Silas stopped at the edge of the yard and looked back at the house. He looked at Abigail, standing with both hands at her sides in the middle of the yard, the kitchen linens forgotten on the ground behind her. "Keep the girls inside," he said. His voice was even, but his eyes carried everything his voice was not saying. "I will," she said. "The fire's moving east. It shouldn't reach the main buildings if the wind holds." A pause. "If the wind changes, then I'll handle it," she said. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, the kind of look that contains a great deal more than the moment it occurs in. And then he was on his horse and moving with the other men toward the ridgeline and the wrong-colored sky. Abigail stood in the yard until the last rider disappeared around the hill. Then she turned to find both girls standing on the porch, Molly gripping the railing, Hazel standing straight with her jaw set and her eyes very bright. "Come inside," Abigail said. "What's happening?" Hazel said. "Fire on the North Ridge. Your father and the men are handling it." She kept her voice at the same temperature it was when she was explaining a recipe. Calm, clear, purposeful. "We're going to be useful here." That word, useful, did something to Hazel's face. Something shifted in it, the brittleness loosening slightly. She came down off the porch. What followed were 6 of the longest hours Abigail had ever spent. She moved through them the way she moved through a complicated kitchen service, with a list in her head and her hands never stopping and her attention divided between everything at once. She sent the 2 youngest ranch hands, who had been left behind due to injury, to fill every available water container from the creek and stack them at intervals between the barn and the main house. She organized the provisions cellar as an emergency shelter, identifying what would need to be moved there first if the fire shifted. She set Hazel to watching the ridgeline from the upper window and reporting any changes in the smoke's direction. Because Hazel needed a job that engaged her mind, and because the information was genuinely useful, and because a girl that age, given real responsibility in a crisis, will almost always rise to it. She was right. Hazel reported with the precision of someone born to it, direction, color, spread, calling down from the window in clipped, accurate phrases that Abigail used to make decisions in the yard below. She set Molly to the task of preparing food and water for whenever the men returned, which she knew would be the case whether the fire lasted 2 hours or 12. Molly, given something to do with her hands, stopped shaking. She moved through the kitchen with focused attention, her small face set with quiet concentration, cutting and laying out and filling canteens with the gravity of someone who had decided that gravity was what the situation required. At 3 in the afternoon, one of the older ranch wives from the neighboring property arrived with her grown daughter, drawn by the smoke and the knowledge that Iron Ridge was short-handed. Abigail put them to work without preamble. They looked at her sideways. She saw it, the quick assessment, the automatic reluctance of women who had not yet decided whether to follow. And then she simply began directing, and they began following. And after 10 minutes, the reluctance was gone, and they were moving together with the efficiency of people who had forgotten to wonder whether they were supposed to trust each other. A half hour later, 3 more people appeared at the gate, then 2 more. Word, in a frontier community, traveled in the direction of trouble. By the time the wind shifted at 4:30, swinging south, pushing the smoke sideways across the ridge in a long dark arm, Abigail had 17 people organized across the property. The barn secured, the animals moved, the food and water staged and ready, and a makeshift medical station set up in the main room for the burns and cuts and exhaustion she knew would be coming home with the men on horseback. When the wind shifted, Hazel's voice came down from the upper window immediately. "The smoke's moving south. It's going away from us." Abigail stood in the yard and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. "Good," she said. "Keep watching." The men began returning as the sun came down behind the mountains, in pairs and small groups, covered in soot. Some of them burned on the hands and forearms, all of them depleted in the particular way that only comes from fighting something larger than yourself for hours on end. She had food on the table before the first horse was unsaddled. She had water and clean cloth for the burns at the medical station. She had done what she had said she would do. Silas came in last.
He stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at what had been assembled there, the organized calm, the injured men being tended, the food being eaten, the girls moving through it all with steady competence. And his face, beneath the soot and the exhaustion, did something that Abigail didn't look directly at because it felt like something private, something that belonged to him. He found her in the kitchen, where she was refilling the coffee pot for the 4th time.
"The north pasture took some damage," he said. His voice was rough from smoke. "2 outbuildings. We lost them. The cattle are mostly accounted for." A pause. "We didn't lose anyone." "I know," she said. "I've been counting as they came in." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him swallow. "You organized all of this." "People organize themselves. I just told them where to stand." Abigail. It was the first time he had used her given name. It stopped her hands on the coffee pot. She set it down and turned to face him. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't have the right words for yet, with the particular helplessness of someone whose vocabulary has been outrun by what they're feeling.
"Thank you," he said. And the weight of it was not the casual weight of ordinary gratitude. It was the weight of a man who had spent 2 years trying to hold everything together alone and had just, for the first time, allowed himself to feel how heavy it had been. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I do," he said, quiet, certain. She held his gaze for a moment. The kitchen was warm around them. From the main room came the low sounds of tired men and the girls' voices, and the particular kind of noise that a full table makes when the people at it have been frightened and are now slowly returning to themselves. "Go eat something," she said. "You're running on fumes and stubbornness." Something crossed his face, the ghost of a smile, unexpected and real. "Is that your professional assessment?" "It's my observation," she said. "Go." He went. She turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, her hands flat on the counter, feeling the warmth of the iron beneath her palms and the deep bone-level exhaustion of the last 6 hours settling into her all at once. She breathed through it. She let it pass. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went back out to the table. It was 3 days after the fire, while the ranch was still in the slow work of assessment and repair, that Abigail found the documents. She hadn't been looking for them. She had been bringing a cup of coffee to Silas's study. He had been sleeping badly since the fire and eating less than he should, and she had added this kind of quiet monitoring to the list of things she did without making a production of it. When she pushed the half-open door and found the room empty and the desk covered in papers she hadn't seen before, she would have left them entirely alone, except for the name at the top of the topmost page, Roland Mercer, and below it, in the cold formal language of legal documents, application for reassignment of historic water rights, Creek Corridor 7, Iron Ridge Properties. She set down the coffee cup. She stood very still and read the page. Then the next one, and the one beneath that. Her hands were very steady. Her mind was not entirely so. The documents were detailed and cleverly constructed, the work of lawyers who knew exactly what they were doing, who had taken years of records and found within them a thread they could pull. The argument being made was technical, built on the specifics of an original land filing from 2 decades ago, and it was designed, she could see it clearly, the way she could see the structure of a recipe even in unfamiliar handwriting, to be just credible enough to tie the case up in territorial court for long enough that the debt note would come due in the meantime, forcing the outcome Mercer wanted before the legal question was even resolved. It was not a legal argument, it was a clock, and it was already running. She heard Silas's boots in the hallway. She stepped back from the desk and was standing beside the window, holding the coffee cup, when he came in. He stopped when he saw her face. Something in it had changed, she knew. She could feel it in the stillness of her own expression, the particular flatness that settled over her when she was working through something she didn't yet know what to do with. "The water rights documents," she said. She didn't apologize for having read them. "How long have you had these?" Silas's jaw tightened. He came into the room and sat down heavily behind the desk. "A week," he said. "Mercer's lawyers filed them in Helena the day before the fire." "He timed it," she said. "He timed it." She sat in the chair across from him. She set the coffee cup on the corner of the desk. She looked at him directly. "Do you know a man named Caleb Sutton?" Silas frowned. "Sutton, east of the Blackfoot River, lost his water rights claim about 3 years back in a territorial dispute. Had to sell off half his herd. He paused. Why?
Because the argument in those documents, she nodded toward the desk, is the same argument. I can see it in the structure. The same kind of filing, the same thread being pulled from an old land record. She leaned forward slightly. If Mercer did this once, there's a record of how it was done. And if Sutton knows how it was done, he might know how it was beaten, or at least how it might have been if he'd had someone fighting beside him. Silas was very still. You want me to go to Sutton, he said slowly. I want you to consider it, she said. 2 ranches with the same story, told together in the same court, to the same judge, is not a coincidence. It's a pattern, and a pattern is something a judge can rule on differently than a single case. The study was very quiet around them. From somewhere in the house came the sound of Molly singing to herself in the particular tuneless way of small children who don't know they're being heard. Silas looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at Abigail. He looked for a moment at the photograph beside his lamp. Sutton and I haven't spoken in 4 years, he said. We had a disagreement about a fence line. I know, she said. Garrett told me. And you still think...
I think, she said carefully, that Roland Mercer is counting on the 2 of you staying on opposite sides of that fence line. I think that is probably one of the reasons the fence line dispute happened the way it did. She paused. I think some people are very good at making sure the people who might stand together remain standing apart.
The silence stretched out. Silas pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and looked at the far wall with the expression of a man rearranging things that have been in one position so long they've left marks. He'd never agree to it, he said. Maybe, she said, but you won't know until you ask, and you asking in itself changes something. She stood. Mercer's clock is running. You have time to be cautious, or you have time to be bold. I don't think you have time for both. She picked up the coffee cup. He still hadn't drunk from it, and moved toward the door. Abigail. She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with that same expression as the night after the fire, the one that had run ahead of his words and left them behind. Were you ever afraid? He said. During the fire, when I left you here with all of it. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, every minute. You didn't show it. Showing it wouldn't have put the water barrels in the right places, she said. Being afraid and being useful aren't mutually exclusive, Mr. Hawthorne. They just require a certain kind of stubbornness. He looked at her for a long moment, and then quietly, with the particular certainty of a man who has arrived at something after a long journey. Silas, he said. My name is Silas. She held his gaze. Something moved in the space between them, not dramatic, not declared, but present and real, and understood by both of them without requiring any more words than the ones already spoken. Good night, Silas, she said. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time in the dark, looking out at the mountains she couldn't see but knew were there. The fire had left a faint smell in the air still, not the wild, dangerous smell of before, but something quieter, the smell of aftermath, of things that had been tested and held. She had told him about Sutton because it was the right move. She had told him the truth about being afraid because he'd asked, and he deserved the truth. She had used his name because he'd offered it, and refusing it would have been a different kind of dishonesty. She had not told him the rest of it, the full picture she was beginning to see, the way a person sees a pattern in a complicated thing when they've been looking at it long enough from the right angle. The fire had not been accidental. She had no proof of that, not yet. Only the timing of it, and the documents filed the day before, and the particular neatness of a man who timed one thing, landing exactly as another thing was burning. She filed that away. She would need more than a feeling before she said it aloud. Outside, the Montana night was very wide and very cold and entirely indifferent to the small, warm light burning in the kitchen window of Iron Ridge Ranch, where a woman stood with flour-dusted hands and a mind moving carefully over the shape of something dangerous, deciding the way she decided everything, quietly, deliberately, and without flinching. Silas rode out to the Sutton Ranch on a Thursday morning, alone, without telling anyone except Garrett and Abigail where he was going. Abigail watched him leave from the kitchen window. She watched the way he sat in the saddle, straight, but with a kind of deliberateness that told her he had made the decision fully, and was not second-guessing it now that it was in motion. She had learned to read him the way she read her oven, not by the numbers, but by the quality of what was coming off it. She turned back to the kitchen and began the morning production. There were 4 pie orders due on the Friday wagon run, 2 loaves promised to Nell Prater, and a standing order from the Millhaven dry goods store that had materialized 2 weeks ago when the storekeeper's wife had tasted a sample and written a note that said, in its entirety, "I need 12 of whatever that was. Name your price." Abigail had named a fair one. The storekeeper had not argued. Hazel was at the counter before she'd even lit the second burner. Molly arrived 7 minutes later with her hair only half braided, which Hazel fixed with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. The 3 of them moved through the kitchen in the rhythm they had built over the past weeks. Wordless in the way that people are wordless when they have learned each other's movements well enough that language is redundant. It was Hazel who broke the silence, about an hour in, without looking up from the dough she was folding. "He went to see Mr. Sutton, didn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Abigail said. Hazel folded the dough once more, pressed the heel of her hand into it. "Sutton hates us." "Your father and Mr. Sutton had a disagreement," Abigail said. "That's different from hate." "He said Papa was a—" Hazel stopped, recalibrated. "He said some things in town 2 years ago. People say things when they're hurting and they don't know how to say they're hurting," Abigail said. She glanced at Hazel. "Your father is going to him anyway. That takes more courage than most people manage." Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then, "What if he says no?" "Then your father will have done the harder thing, which is ask. And we'll find another way." Abigail set a finished pie aside and began on the next. "There's always another way, Hazel. It's usually less elegant and more work. But it exists." Molly, who had been listening with the complete stillness of a child who absorbs everything, said quietly, "I hope Mr. Sutton says yes." "So do I," said Abigail. Silas came home in the late afternoon when the light was going gold and long across the frozen ground. Abigail heard his horse in the yard and kept her hands busy, because whatever had happened needed to land in him first before she asked about it. He came through the back door, which was unusual. He always came in through the front. The back door was the kitchen door. She kept her eyes on the stove. She heard him take off his coat. She heard him sit down at the kitchen table. She heard the specific quality of a man's silence when something inside it is trying to work itself out. She poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of him without comment, then went back to the stove. After a long moment, he said, He listened. She turned then. Silas was looking at the coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it. Took about 20 minutes before he stopped looking at me like he wanted to throw me off his property. Then he just listened, didn't say much, asked 2 questions about the documents. He paused. He recognized the filing structure immediately. He said his lawyer pointed out the exact same thread in his case, but they didn't know how to argue against it in time. But he knows now, she said. 3 years of knowing, Silas said. 3 years of sitting on the wrong side of what Mercer did to him and understanding exactly how it was done. Abigail sat down across from him. And he looked up. The exhaustion was still there. It was always there now. But beneath it, something had shifted, the way the quality of light shifts when a cloud moves. He's coming to Helena. He'll testify about his own case. His lawyer's willing to file a joint motion arguing pattern of conduct. Silas set down the coffee cup. He also said, he stopped, looked at the table, then back at her. He said he should have come to me 3 years ago, before his case went the way it did. He said he let Mercer keep us apart because it was easier than swallowing his pride and crossing that fence line. A beat. He said that directly, without me asking. That's a hard thing to say, Abigail said. It is, Silas agreed. I told him the fence line dispute was my fault as much as his, which is probably true. He almost smiled. We didn't exactly hug it out, but we shook hands, and he means it. I could tell. Good, she said, simply the way she said most things. Silas looked at her for a moment. This was your idea, he said. It was a suggestion. Don't do that, he said. Quiet, but direct. Don't make yourself smaller than you are. I've noticed you do that. You say, I just and only, and it was just a thought. It's a habit, and it doesn't serve you, and it doesn't serve the truth.
He held her gaze steadily. This was your idea. It was a good one. Take credit for it. The kitchen was very still around them. She was not accustomed to being seen this precisely. It was, she found, both uncomfortable and something else, something warmer that she didn't immediately have a name for. All right, she said. It was a good idea. Yes, he said. It was. He drank his coffee. Outside, the girls could be heard in the yard, Hazel's voice giving instructions about something, and Molly laughing at them, and the sound of it moved through the kitchen like a current of warm air. The legal proceedings in Helena began in the second week of June. Silas left with his lawyer, a spare, precise man named Aldous Finch, who wore the same expression whether delivering good news or bad, and had the peculiar gift of making Roland Mercer's elaborate legal team look slightly overdressed by sheer force of unhurried confidence. Caleb Sutton traveled separately with his own counsel, and the arrangement between them, still new, still careful, the way repaired things are careful, held its shape. Mercer arrived in Helena with 4 lawyers, 2 assistants, and the particular manner of a man who has never seriously entertained the possibility of losing. Abigail heard this from Garrett, who had a cousin who worked at the territorial courthouse and sent letters with reliable frequency. He's brought character witnesses, Garrett told her, reading from the latest letter at the kitchen table. People willing to testify that Hawthorne's financial mismanagement, not water rights manipulation, is the real issue here. That's not a legal argument, Abigail said. That's a distraction. Mercer's very good at distractions. I know, she said. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it the same way she thought about a complicated recipe, not from the ingredients outward, but from the final result backward. What did a judge need to see? Not just the legal argument. The legal argument was Aldous Finch's territory, and she trusted Finch's competence. But courts existed in communities, and communities had memories, and what a community said about a man, loudly, collectively, publicly, mattered even inside a courthouse. She wiped her hands on her apron. She sat down across from Garrett. How many families in this valley have bought from the wagon runs? She said. Garrett thought about it. Counting the settlements east, 30, maybe 35? And how many of them, she said carefully, have had some kind of trouble with Mercer over the years? Not necessarily legal trouble. Fence line problems, grazing disputes, a water claim quietly redirected, a loan called in early. Garrett was very still for a moment. He set the letter down. He looked at her with the expression of a man watching something click into place. More than a few, he said slowly. I need names, she said, and I need to talk to their wives. He stared at her. Their wives. The men will talk to their lawyers and their neighbors, she said. The women will talk to the judge's clerk, the court reporter, the woman who runs the boarding house where the legal team is staying. Every person in that courthouse who isn't officially relevant to the proceedings. She held his gaze. Information travels through different channels. I want to use the ones Mercer hasn't thought to monitor. Garrett was quiet for a long time. Then he said slowly and with what appeared to be genuine wonder, Where did you come from? Hargrove Falls, she said, by way of a cold walk in a supply wagon. Can you get me the names? He could. He did. What followed was 2 weeks of the most sustained effort Abigail had undertaken since arriving at Iron Ridge, and she had not been idle since arriving at Iron Ridge. Every morning before the kitchen work began, and every evening after it was finished, she wrote letters. She wrote to the wives and sisters and mothers of families across the valley, careful letters that did not ask for anything dramatic, that did not call for confrontation or risk. They asked only for memory. They asked, Do you remember when this happened? Do you still have the letter that was sent? Do you know anyone else who was told the same thing? The responses came back steadily, and they were more than she had hoped for. Because it turned out that women on the frontier, who kept the household records and the correspondence files and the inventory of everything that came and went, remembered things with precise and terrible clarity. They had been waiting, many of them, for someone to ask. She also kept baking. This was not incidental. The wagon runs continued through the legal proceedings, and what went out on those wagons carried more than pies. Every delivery was a conversation, and every conversation was a reminder that Iron Ridge still stood, that it was functioning, that the woman running its kitchen was not panicked,
and the ranch was not finished, and Roland Mercer had not, in fact, already won. The community, which had been uncertain, began to choose a side. Not dramatically. There were no speeches, no confrontations in the town square, no formal declarations. It was quieter than that and more durable. It was the way people show up when they've decided to show up. A neighboring rancher letting his hands help repair the fire-damaged outbuildings without being asked and refusing payment afterward. 3 families from the eastern settlements writing to the territorial courthouse requesting that the water rights case be given full hearing, citing their own interests in the corridor. Nell Prater, who had once cheerfully relayed gossip about Silas's dwindling options, arriving at the ranch gate one morning with a crate of canning jars and her eldest daughter, and the no-nonsense expression of a woman who had recently reconsidered her position on things and was now acting accordingly. "Tell me what you need done," Nell said, standing in the yard. Abigail looked at her for a moment, then, "Come inside, I'll show you." The hardest day of those 2 weeks was the day Roland Mercer came to Iron Ridge himself. He arrived without announcement, mid-morning on a Wednesday, in a black carriage that was considerably more expensive than anything else on the road between Millhaven and the ranch. He was a large man, not tall, but dense with the particular density of someone who had spent decades getting what he wanted and had the physical confidence that comes with it. His face was the face of a man who had learned to smile at the right moments and had been doing it for long enough that the smile no longer required anything behind it. He came to the kitchen door. Abigail opened it. He looked at her with the rapid, dismissive assessment that she had spent 28 years learning to absorb without showing that she'd felt it. Then he smiled, and the smile was excellent, warm, reasonable, completely empty. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "Mr. Mercer," she said. She did not move from the doorway. She did not invite him in. A flicker of something crossed his face. Mild surprise, quickly managed. "I'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment." One reasonable person to another. "Mr. Hawthorne is in Helena," she said. "If you have business with Iron Ridge, you'll need to address it there." "I'm not here about business," he said. "I'm here about you." He tilted his head slightly. "You're an intelligent woman. Anyone can see that. And you've done impressive things here. The kitchen operation, the community goodwill you've built. Genuinely impressive." He paused. "But you're building all of it on ground that isn't going to hold. This ranch has a debt that can't be paid and a water claim that won't survive the Helena ruling. I think you know that." Another pause. "I could offer you something else. A position at my property, better wages, better facilities, full operation of my household kitchen. You'd have real resources behind you." He smiled again. "Think about what you could do with that." She looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I appreciate you making the trip. But I'm going to tell you something plainly because I think plainness is more respectful than pretending we're having a different conversation than we're having." She kept her voice even, her expression neither hostile nor warm. "I'm not for sale. And neither is this ranch. The ground I'm standing on is going to hold. And I think, somewhere under that very polished manner of yours, you're here because you're beginning to suspect the same thing." The smile stayed on his face, but something behind it went very flat. "You're making a mistake," he said. Quiet now. The warmth entirely gone. "I make them occasionally," she said. "This isn't one of them." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for exactly 5 seconds, feeling her heart moving harder than she would have preferred. Then she went back to the stove. Hazel was standing in the interior doorway, very still, with an expression Abigail had never seen on her before, something between awe and fierce, private satisfaction. "You just closed the door on Roland Mercer," Hazel said. "I did," Abigail said. She checked the pie in the oven. "Don't make a thing of it." Hazel made a thing of it. She told Garrett, who told 2 of the ranch hands, and by supper the entire property knew about it. And the mood at the dinner table had the particular energy of people who have been given something to feel good about after a long stretch of not feeling good about things. She wrote to Silas that evening. She told him Mercer had come. She told him what was said. She kept the letter factual because facts were what he needed, and because the other things, well, what she had felt closing that door, what she felt now writing to him by lamplight, were not for a letter. She folded it and gave it to Garrett for the morning post. She did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, exactly, from the particular restlessness of someone who is committed to a course and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up to the decision. The letter from Helena came 9 days later. It arrived on the afternoon wagon, tucked between a package for Garrett and 3 replies from the women she'd contacted. Abigail recognized Silas's handwriting on the outside and carried it inside without opening it, setting it on the kitchen table and finishing the pie she was in the middle of, because there was a method to things, and the pie needed to come out of the oven at a specific moment, regardless of what was happening in territorial court. She took the pie out, she set it on the cooling rack. She washed her hands, then she sat down and opened the letter. She read it once. Then she set it flat on the table with both palms pressed down on it and sat very still, looking at the grain of the wood beneath the paper. The motion had been granted. The joint filing had been accepted. The judge had agreed to hear the combined testimony of both Hawthorne and Sutton, with the pattern of conduct argument at the center. The Helena proceedings would continue for at least another 2 weeks, but Aldous Finch's letter to Silas, which Silas had copied into his own letter to her, in his careful, compressed handwriting, described the judge's response to the pattern argument as, in Finch's measured professional language, notably attentive. Notably attentive. From Aldous Finch, she had been given to understand this was approximately equivalent to anyone else shouting from a rooftop. She sat with this for a moment. She let herself feel it, the clean, uncomplicated surge of it, without diminishing it or containing it before it had fully arrived. She had learned, from a life of making herself smaller, that some moments deserved to be felt at their full size. Then Molly came into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of the cooling pie, and stopped when she saw Abigail's face. "Is something wrong?" she said. "No," Abigail said, and she meant it in the largest possible sense of the word. "Something is going right." Molly climbed onto the chair across from her and looked at the letter, which she couldn't read from that angle, and then at Abigail, whom she had learned to read better than any letter. Whatever she saw there made the small, serious face open into something warm and trusting. "About Papa," she said. "About your father? About this ranch? About all of it." Abigail folded the letter. "He's doing well, Molly. He's fighting hard, and he's not alone." Molly was quiet for a moment, looking at the pie on the rack behind Abigail. Then she said, "Can we have some pie?" Abigail laughed. It came out of her easily, the way things come out of you when you've stopped bracing against them, and it filled the kitchen with the sound of something that had been building for a very long time. "We can have some pie," she said. She cut 2 generous slices, and Hazel materialized from somewhere in the house within 90 seconds of the first plate hitting the table, which suggested she had been paying close attention to the kitchen sounds, as she always was, as she always would be. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table in the long afternoon light and ate, and the ranch went on around them, the hands working in the yard, the barn settling in the early warmth, the mountains standing as they always stood, enormous and patient and utterly indifferent to the small kitchen full of warmth and women and the particular sound of people who have been through something hard together and come through the other side of it. Outside, the Montana sky was wide and clear and very blue. The kind of blue, Abigail thought, that makes you feel like the world is larger than the worst things in it. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket. She thought about Silas and Helena, sitting across from Aldous Finch with the careful stillness of a man who had learned to hold himself together under pressure and was doing it still. She thought about Caleb Sutton in a chair beside him, a stranger who had become an ally because someone had been willing to cross a fence line and ask. She thought about the $31 in a flour tin and the old pie pan dented on one side, and the frozen ground she had walked 14 miles across to find a door to knock on. She thought about how none of it had looked from the outside like the beginning of anything, and yet here they were. She thought, the bread doesn't know it's going to rise. She ate her pie. She listened to Hazel talk about something that had happened in the yard that morning, some small drama between 2 of the younger hands that she described, with the precise and slightly merciless wit of a girl who missed nothing. She listened to Molly ask a question that had nothing to do with anything except the natural curiosity of a child who felt safe enough to be curious. She let the afternoon hold them. She let the warmth of the kitchen be what it was. Not a solution, not a conclusion, just a place where people who cared about each other had gathered and were, for this moment, simply present. The ruling was still 2 weeks away. There was still work to do, still letters to write, still wagon runs to organize and orders to fill, and a ranch to keep running. Roland Mercer had not conceded anything and would not until a judge made him. But the tide had turned. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows it, in the quality of the air, in the way things were sitting. Something had shifted in the architecture of this fight, and it had shifted because enough people had been willing to stand in the same direction at the same time. She set down her fork. She looked at the kitchen around her. The copper pots, the iron stove, the window with its view of the yard and the mountains beyond it. The two girls at the table with flour that was somehow still in Molly's hair from the morning. She thought, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. And for a woman who had started this year with nothing, standing at the edge of a shallow grave in frozen ground with $31 in an old pie tin and nowhere in the world to go, that was not a small thing. That was in fact everything. The second letter from Helena arrived on a Friday, and it arrived differently than the first. The first had come tucked between packages, anonymous among the ordinary freight of a supply wagon. This one came with a rider, a young man on a fast horse who arrived at the Iron Ridge gate before breakfast, while the morning was still gray and the frost still held on the fence posts, and who asked for Miss Rowan by name. Abigail was in the kitchen when Garrett brought him to the door. She dried her hands on her apron and took the sealed envelope, and the young rider accepted the coffee she offered him and stood by the stove warming his hands while she opened it. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, the same place she had rolled 10,000 rounds of dough, the same place she had learned the topography of this household by touch and repetition, the same place she had become, without entirely planning it, the steady center of something larger than a kitchen. Her face, as she read, gave nothing away to the room. She had learned that discipline early and kept it long, but her hands, which she pressed flat against the counter when she finished, were trembling very slightly. The letter was from Aldous Finch, not Silas. Finch did not traffic in sentiment or preamble. His letter was 4 paragraphs of clean, precise legal language that said, in its careful professional way, that Judge Emmett Carver of the Territorial Court of Montana had issued his ruling the previous afternoon, that the joint filing of Hawthorne and Sutton, arguing pattern of conduct in Roland Mercer's long history of water rights manipulation across the Northern Corridor, had been received and found compelling by the court, that Judge Carver had ruled the original Iron Ridge water rights claim fully valid and permanently secured under territorial law, that the Mercer filing had been dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled in any amended form, and that a separate inquiry had been opened into Mercer's land office dealings over the preceding decade based on documentation entered as evidence during the joint proceedings. The 4th paragraph was the shortest. It said only, Mr. Hawthorne will depart Helena this morning and should arrive at the ranch by Saturday evening. He asked me to convey that he is well. Abigail stood with her palms flat on the counter for a long moment. Around her, the kitchen continued its ordinary work, the stove ticking, the coffee heating, the morning light coming in through the window at its familiar angle, and all of it felt, in this moment, suffused with something she didn't try to name, because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. She looked up at the young rider by the stove. Thank you, she said. Drink your coffee. There's bread coming out in 10 minutes. He looked startled, then grateful, with the particular gratitude of a young man who had ridden hard and hadn't eaten. She went to the door of the kitchen and raised her voice toward the back of the house. Hazel, a pause, then boots on the stairs, rapid. Hazel appeared at the bottom, her dark hair loose, her expression already sharpened with the intuition of a girl who had learned to read Abigail's voice with the same precision Abigail read everything else. What happened? Hazel said. Abigail held up the letter. Your father won, she said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Hazel crossed the hallway in 4 steps, took the letter from her hands, and read it standing in the kitchen doorway, her lips moving slightly on the legal language, her face working through things too fast and too large to fully contain. When she finished, she looked up. Her eyes were very bright. Her jaw was set in the way it always was, the armor of a girl who had decided at some young age that the world required a certain hardness to survive, and who had been right about that, and who was now encountering a moment that did not require hardness and didn't entirely know what to do with that. He won, she said. The word came out flat,
But the flatness was the flatness of something being held very carefully, not something empty. "He won," Abigail said. Hazel looked at the letter again, then at Abigail. And then, with no warning and very little ceremony, she closed the distance between them and put her arms around Abigail's waist and pressed her face against her shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't cry because Hazel Hawthorne did not cry in front of people if she could help it. She simply held on with the fierce, particular grip of a 12-year-old girl who had been holding everything together by herself for 2 years and who was, in this moment, allowing herself to not do that. Abigail put her arms around her. She held on back, steady and without fuss, the way she did everything. After a moment, from somewhere above them on the stairs, a small voice. "Hazel? What's happening?" Hazel pulled back, straightened, set her jaw. "Papa won," she called up, her voice almost entirely even. "Come down!" The sound of Molly coming down the stairs at speed was followed immediately by Molly herself, still in her nightgown, arriving at the kitchen doorway with enormous eyes, and then crossing the room and inserting herself between Hazel and Abigail with the complete physical confidence of a small child who has decided that this is where she belongs. The three of them stood in the kitchen in the early morning light while the stove ticked and the coffee boiled over, which Abigail caught just in time, and nobody said very much more because there wasn't very much more that needed to be said. Garrett heard the news from the young rider as he was leaving, and Garrett told the ranch hands, and the news moved through Iron Ridge the way all significant news moves through a tight community, fast and with elaboration. By mid-morning, there was a particular quality to the air on the property, a looseness in the way men moved and spoke and leaned against fences that Abigail recognized as relief expressing itself in the bodies of people who had been braced against something for a very long time. Denny Potts, the youngest hand, actually let out a whoop from somewhere near the barn that carried all the way to the kitchen window. She kept working. There was a Friday wagon run to prepare, and the fact that the legal battle had been won did not alter the blackberry preserves that needed to be jarred or the 4 pie orders waiting on the production list. If anything, she worked with more focus than usual because the particular energy of relief needed somewhere to go, and she had always been the kind of person who turned large feelings into productive motion. By the time the wagon left at noon, she had filled every order, added 2 extra loaves she hadn't planned on, and started a batch of something she hadn't made in years. A honey bread, yellow crumbed and slightly sweet, from a recipe she carried in memory rather than from the cookbook, because some recipes live in the hands and don't need paper. Molly, who came into the kitchen in the afternoon and stopped at the smell of it, went very still. "That's—" She stopped. "I know," Abigail said gently. "Your mother's recipe. Hazel told me about it a while back. I worked it out from what she described." She paused. "Is it all right? I can put it away if—" "No," Molly said, fast and certain. "Please don't." She came to the counter and stood on her toes to look at the loaves cooling on the rack. "She made it on Fridays," she said quietly. "It was a Friday thing." "Then it should be a Friday thing," Abigail said. Molly reached out and very carefully touched the side of the nearest loaf. The way you touch something you want to be sure is real. "Thank you," she said. The way she said it was not the ordinary thank you of a child receiving something. It was older than that and heavier, and Abigail received it as what it was. Silas arrived home on Saturday evening, as Finch's letter had said he would. Abigail heard the horse in the yard first. She always heard the horses before anyone else, because the kitchen window faced the gate. And she looked up from what she was doing, which was assembling the last of a pie order that she'd agreed to deliver on Sunday. She watched him dismount in the fading light. She watched Garrett meet him in the yard and grip his hand, and the exchange between them. Brief, contained, the language of men who showed things with their hands rather than their mouths. She went back to the pie. She heard the front door open. She heard Molly's voice, then Hazel's, both at once, overlapping in the way they never usually allowed themselves. She heard Silas's voice beneath them, low, warm, doing something it rarely did, which was nothing in particular except be present with his daughters without the weight of crisis on it. She heard the sound of it from the kitchen and kept her hands on the pie crust, pressing the edges even, and breathed slowly. She was still at the counter when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked different, not younger. The lines were the same. The silver at the temples was the same. But something in how he was carrying himself had changed. The compression was gone.
The sense of a man holding himself together through the discipline of his own spine, the posture she had read on the very first day and tracked through every subsequent one, had released into something more open. He looked like a man who had set something down and not yet picked it back up again, and was discovering, with some surprise, how much better his hands felt empty. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, at the copper pots and the iron stove and the cooling pie and the honey bread she'd left on the back of the counter. At her, standing at the work surface with flour on her apron and her hair escaping its braid in the way it always did by Saturday evening. "You made honey bread," he said. "Molly said it was a Friday thing," she said. "I made it yesterday. There should still be some." He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you get the recipe?" "I reconstructed it from what Hazel described." She kept her hands moving on the pie. "I hope that's all right." He came into the kitchen. He sat down at the table, and there was nothing performative about it. He simply sat, the way a man sits when he has arrived somewhere after a long journey, and his body recognizes the place as one where sitting is allowed. "Aldous told me what you did," he said. "The letters to the Valley families, the testimonials collected, the way the community showed up." He paused. He said the judge commented on it, said it wasn't legally relevant, but that he'd rarely seen a community so unified in its support for one side of a property case. "People had their own reasons," she said. "I just gave them a way to say so." "Abigail." She stopped, looked at him. "I'm not going to let you make yourself smaller than you are," he said. He said it with the same quiet directness he'd used before. The first time he'd said it to her, except that something about it was different now. Closer, perhaps. Less like a correction and more like a declaration. "I made that mistake with you once, and you let me because you're accustomed to it. I'd like to stop." She held his gaze steadily. "All right," she said. "What you did here?" He stopped. Seemed to be choosing words with more care than usual. "While I was in Helena. The fire. Mercer coming here. The letters, the community. The wagon runs that kept this ranch solvent while the legal fight was happening." He pressed his hands flat on the table in front of him, a gesture she recognized as her own, the gesture of someone grounding themselves before saying something that matters. "You held this place. You held my family." He paused. "You held me, in ways I didn't even fully see while they were happening." The kitchen was very quiet around them. From somewhere in the house came the sound of the girls, distant and ordinary. Hazel's voice, Molly's laughter. The sound of the house at ease with itself in a way it hadn't been for a very long time. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I've noticed you respect plainness." He looked at her directly, with the full, clear attention of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has decided to stop thinking and speak. "I would like you to stay at Iron Ridge, not as my cook, not as an employee. I would like you to stay as my partner, as—" He paused, and something moved across his face that was almost uncertainty, and she understood that this man, who had managed 2 years of crisis with steady composure, was sitting at her kitchen table being genuinely, simply nervous. "As my wife, if that's something you would choose." The word hung in the warm kitchen air between them. She looked at him for a long moment, at the lines around his eyes and the silver in his hair and the photograph on his desk that he always replaced at exactly the same angle, and at the expression on his face now, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and direct and quietly terrified in the way of someone who has handed something valuable to another person and is waiting to find out if it will be held carefully. She thought about the frozen ground and the shallow grave and the $31 in the flour tin. She thought about the 14-mile walk across a Montana winter and the laughter of the men on the saloon porch and the land office man who had handed her a scrap of paper with barely concealed doubt. She thought about the first night in a cold kitchen, pressing her palm against her uncle's cookbook, telling herself the bread doesn't know it's going to rise. She thought about Hazel's arms around her waist in the kitchen hallway. She thought about Molly's hand touching the honey bread. She thought about the sound of this house full of people and the specific quality of warmth that happens when a place becomes, genuinely and without pretending, a home. She set down the pie. She sat down across from him. "I'm not coming from a place of necessity," she said. "I want to say that first because I need you to know the difference. I have the pie business. I have the wagon contracts. If I left tomorrow, I could find work and I could manage." She held his gaze. I'm saying yes because I want to. Because this kitchen is the first place I have felt, in longer than I can remember, completely myself. Because your daughters have given me something I didn't know I was missing. And because she stopped, found the words, the true ones, without decorating them. Because you see me clearly, Silas. You push back when I make myself smaller. You said thank you and meant it and made me hear it. You are one of the few people in my life who has looked at me and seen the whole of it, not just the part that was convenient to see. She paused. That is not a small thing. He was very still across the table from her. So yes, she said, I'm staying, not as your cook and not out of need, as your partner, if that's truly what you're asking. That's truly what I'm asking, he said. Then yes, she said, simply, fully, with the same directness she had used in every difficult room she had ever walked into. Yes, what happened next was not dramatic. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the kitchen for a while without saying very much at all, and the stove ticked and the evening light faded, and somewhere in the house Molly was singing to herself in the tuneless way she always did, the sound of a child who felt safe enough to make noise without reason. It was Hazel who found them. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression of a 12-year-old who has assessed a situation in approximately 1 second and arrived at a conclusion she intends to present as if she had been expecting it all along. She looked at her father's hand over Abigail's on the kitchen table. She looked at her father's face and then at Abigail's. Finally, she said. Flat, completely dry. Then she turned and walked back down the hallway, calling over her shoulder, Molly, come down. I have something to tell you. Abigail looked at Silas. He looked at her, and they both laughed, real laughter, the kind that arrives without permission, that is made of relief and affection, and the absurd particular joy of being known accurately by a 12-year-old who will never let you forget that she saw it first. Molly's response, when Hazel delivered the news with her characteristic economy, was to come to the kitchen at speed, look at the two of them for a long moment with her enormous, serious eyes, and then climb onto the chair beside Abigail and lean her head against Abigail's arm without saying anything at all. Which was, Abigail thought, pressing her own head gently against the top of Molly's, the most complete yes she had ever received from anyone. The summer that followed moved at a different pace than anything that had come before it. The legal ruling had done more than secure the water rights. It had shifted the landscape of the entire valley in ways that took weeks to fully understand. The separate inquiry into Roland Mercer's land office dealings opened slowly, but with the particular thoroughness of a process that has found a thread and intends to follow it to the end. 3 families who had lost water claims in the preceding decade came forward with documentation. 2 former land office employees gave statements. The inquiry moved into autumn, and by the time the leaves on the ridge had turned and the first cold front came off the mountains, it had become clear that Roland Mercer's dominance in the northern corridor was not merely stalled, but structurally dismantled. He did not leave the territory. Men like Mercer did not leave. But he contracted. He pulled back. His name, which had moved through every conversation in Millhaven with the weight of inevitability, began to be spoken more quietly, and then less often, and eventually it became what the names of powerful men always eventually become when the power drains out of them. Just a name. Caleb Sutton rode over to Iron Ridge in August. He arrived in the yard on a Tuesday afternoon and sat with Silas on the porch for 3 hours. Abigail brought them coffee and stayed out of it, because some things needed to happen between men without an audience, and because she could hear through the window well enough to know that what was being said was the right kind of thing, the kind of slowly building conversation between 2 people who are relearning how to trust each other after a long estrangement. When Sutton left, he shook Silas's hand. Then he walked past the kitchen window and stopped. Abigail opened the window. He was a lean, weathered man with a direct gaze and the kind of face that had been through things and not bothered to hide it. He looked at her for a moment. You're the one who wrote to my sister, he said. I wrote to a number of people, she said. Yes. My sister said your letter was the reason she dug out the old records from the water claim dispute. She said she'd been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. He paused. She also said the pies were exceptional. Your sister was very helpful, Abigail said. I'm glad to know it made a difference. He nodded, started to turn, then stopped again. That was a smart thing you did, he said. The letters, the community. Doing it the way you did it. He looked at her steadily. Mercer never saw it coming because he doesn't understand how things actually hold together out here. He thinks it's land and money and legal papers. He shook his head slightly. It's not. It's people. It's always been people. Yes, she said. He tipped his hat. He rode out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go. And she thought about what he'd said, and she thought he was right. And she thought that this was something she had known her entire life without ever having the words for it quite the way he'd just put it. It's people. It's always been people. The wedding was in September, on a Saturday, in the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch. There was no ceremony in the elaborate sense, there was no church, and there was no expensive dress, and there was no imported anything. What there was, the yard cleared and swept, the fence posts strung with whatever wildflowers the girls had gathered from the ridge the morning before. Garrett Cole, standing with the broad, quietly moved expression of a man who has been hoping for something long enough to have almost stopped hoping. The ranch hands in their cleanest shirts. Nell Prater weeping cheerfully into a handkerchief from the moment the proceedings began. Caleb Sutton and his wife standing at the edge of the gathered crowd with the slightly uncertain ease of people still learning how to be welcome somewhere and beginning to believe they are. Molly wore her best dress and stood as close to Abigail as she could throughout the entire proceedings. Hazel stood on Abigail's other side, straight-backed and composed, wearing the expression she always wore when she was feeling something large that she had decided to contain, except that her eyes, when they caught Abigail's, were warm and unguarded in a way that she had stopped trying to hide, because it had become too much work to hide from someone who already knew you. Abigail wore a dress that Nell Prater and 3 other women had made for her over the preceding 3 weeks, in a blue-gray that Nell had described as the color of Montana sky in late afternoon, which was either very romantic or a practical coincidence depending on your disposition. It fit her exactly as she was, because the women who made it knew her and had no interest in making her into something else. When Silas took her hands in the yard and said the words he'd prepared, quietly, without theater, looking at her with the clear and steady attention she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world when he was being fully honest. She felt the weight of the day, not as ceremony, but as truth. The thing being said was true. The place where it was being said was true. The people standing around them were people she had cooked for and worried about and written letters on behalf of and sat beside in hard moments, and they were true too. She said her part. She meant it completely. Hazel, who had not planned to cry and had told Molly with great firmness that she would not be crying, cried. She did it facing away from the crowd, toward the mountains, which Abigail noticed and said nothing about, now or ever. Molly held Abigail's hand through the reception and only let go to eat, which she did with impressive focus, and then reclaimed it immediately after. The celebration lasted until the moon was high and the Montana stars had arranged themselves in their cold and lavish display above the mountains. And by the time the last guest had ridden or walked home through the September dark, the yard was quiet and the girls were asleep, and Iron Ridge Ranch lay still and solid under the sky, breathing in the easy way of a place that has been through the worst of things and knows it can hold. Silas found her standing at the kitchen window that she had stood at more times than she could count, the one that looked out toward the barn and the fence line and the mountains beyond. He stood beside her and looked out at the same dark yard. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered it honestly. "I'm thinking about my uncle," she said. "I'm thinking he would have liked this place." "Tell me about him." So she did. Standing at the kitchen window on the night of her wedding, she told Silas about Oliver Cray, about the bakery and the flour-stained recipes and the extra rolls pressed into the hands of families who couldn't afford them, about the laugh that could fill a room, about the pie tin dented on one side, about everything he had taught her without always knowing he was teaching it. She talked for a long time, and Silas listened the way he did everything, fully and without interruption. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "He sounds like someone who understood what mattered." "He did," she said. "He always did." Silas put his arm around her. She leaned into him, and they stood at the kitchen window together while Montana went on being enormous and dark and patient around them. And she felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, the particular completeness of a person who has arrived, truly and finally, where they are meant to be.
The pie business grew through the autumn and into the following year in ways that surprised even Abigail, who had written the original figures with deliberately modest projections because she had learned, from a lifetime of being underestimated, the value of delivering more than expected rather than less. By the following spring, the wagon runs had expanded to 5 settlements. By summer, a standing weekly order had come in from the largest trading post in Mill Haven, followed by a request from a hotel in a town 2 days' ride east that had heard about the preserves specifically. Abigail kept the books herself, the way her uncle had kept the bakery books. Carefully, nightly, in the small leather ledger she had bought with part of the first month's profits. She hired Nell Prater's eldest daughter 3 mornings a week. She hired a woman from the eastern settlements named Clara, who had a talent for pastry work that was immediately obvious, and who needed the income with the same urgency Abigail had needed the Iron Ridge position 8 months earlier. She hired without condescension and paid without hesitation and held the standard without apology, and the women who worked in the Iron Ridge kitchen learned quickly that Abigail Rowan Hawthorne meant what she said and said what she meant, and would push you harder than you thought you could go and trust you more than you thought you'd earned, and that both of those things were gifts. Hazel turned 13 in February and announced, with the tone of someone who has given this careful thought and is now informing you of a conclusion rather than asking your opinion, that she intended to help manage the business accounts when she was old enough. Abigail said she could start now. Hazel looked at her the way she looked at things she hadn't expected. Then she pulled up a chair. They spent 2 evenings a week at the kitchen table with the ledger between them, Abigail explaining the logic behind each entry, and Hazel absorbing it with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided was worth her attention. By spring, she was catching errors before Abigail found them, which Abigail pointed out and praised directly, because she had learned from being on the other side of it how much it mattered to be told plainly when you were doing something right. Molly, who had no particular interest in the accounts, had discovered that she had a gift for bread, specifically for the intuitive adjustments that couldn't be taught from a recipe, the small decisions made by feel and attention, the kind of cooking that came from understanding the material rather than following the instruction. She was 9 years old, and she was already doing things in the kitchen that Abigail had taken years to learn. She did them quietly, without announcement, which was so characteristic of her that it made Abigail smile every time she saw it. The photograph on the mantel stayed where it was, the one of the dark-haired woman with the defiant smile and her arms around 2 smaller versions of the girls who had eaten cobbler in the kitchen on Abigail's first night. It had always been there, and it remained there, because nobody at Iron Ridge was interested in the idea that healing required the erasure of what had come before. Abigail dusted it on Saturdays, the same day she dusted everything else. She did it with the same attention she brought to everything. Not with sentiment, not with distance, but with the simple respect due to someone who had mattered to people she loved. The girls noticed. Of course they noticed. They noticed everything. One Sunday in March, Molly came to stand beside her while she was dusting the mantel and looked at the photograph and then at Abigail and said, "Do you think she knows about how things are now?" Abigail looked at the photograph for a moment, at the defiant smile and the dark eyes that were reproduced almost exactly in the faces of both daughters. "I think," she said carefully, "that a woman who loved her family the way your mother clearly did would be very glad to know they were loved and safe." She paused. "And I think she would be pleased about the honey bread." Molly smiled. It was a small and real and private smile, not performed for anyone's benefit, the smile of a child who has found a way to hold 2 true things at once without either one diminishing the other. "I think so too," she said. That summer, Silas took her riding for the first time. North, up into the hills where the fire had come from, where the grass was growing back now, with the particular insistence of things that have been burned and survived it. They rode to the top of the ridge and looked out over the valley below. Iron Ridge Ranch at the center of it, smaller from this height than it felt from inside it, but solid and present and unmistakably there, with the creek catching the afternoon light to the south and the mountains holding everything in their enormous, patient arms. "What do you see?" he'd said. She looked for a long time. "Everything," she said. He looked at her sideways with the almost smile that she had catalogued from its first appearance and continued to find, after a year of marriage, unexpectedly affecting. "That's a very large answer." "It's a very large view," she said. He laughed. She turned to look at him because she still did that.
turned to look when he laughed, the way you turn toward a sound you don't want to miss. He was looking out over the valley with his face open and at ease in the afternoon light, and she thought, not for the first time, that grief had borrowed his face for a long time and was only now, slowly, returning it. She thought about the man who had come to the kitchen door of a cold ranch on a gray morning and said, with the carefulness of someone managing expectations that had been disappointed before, "Supper's at 6. Can you work with what's there?" She thought about what it took and how long it took and how many biscuits and cobbler portions and cups of coffee and late evenings at a kitchen table it took to turn a household of separate people all pointing in different directions into a family. She thought about how that transformation happened not in a single moment, but in 10,000 small ones, each of them unremarkable on its own. A pie left on a counter, a child's hands in bread dough, a door closed in a powerful man's face, a letter written in lamplight, a hand taken across a kitchen table on an autumn evening. She thought about the bread that doesn't know it's going to rise. She thought, Uncle Cray, you would have loved all of this. You would have loved them. The ache that came with that thought was real, and she didn't push it away. She let it be what it was, the specific shape of a love that was still present even in the person who held it being gone, the way a room keeps its warmth for a while after the fire is banked. She had learned over the course of this year that this was not weakness. It was just the honest arithmetic of having loved someone. "Ready to go down?" Silas said. She looked at the valley one more time, at the ranch and the creek and the long light, and the mountains holding everything steady in the distance. "Yes," she said. They rode down together through the new grass, through the land that had been burned and was growing back, through the afternoon light that was going gold and long across the Montana plain, back toward the ranch where the kitchen window was already lit, and the smoke from the dinner fire was rising in a clean straight line in the still air. And from somewhere inside, the sound of Molly's tuneless singing drifted out to meet them as they came through the gate. Garrett raised a hand from the corral. The hands moved in the yard with the quiet efficiency of a place that knew its business. Hazel appeared on the porch with the expression she always wore when they'd been gone longer than she thought necessary. Arms crossed, eyebrows slightly elevated, performing severity over the relief she would never entirely admit to. "Supper's been ready for 20 minutes, she said. "We know," Silas said. We could smell it from the ridge." Hazel's mouth did something complicated. Then she turned and went back inside, and through the kitchen window Abigail could see her saying something to Molly, who looked up and saw them through the glass and waved with the full-arm enthusiasm of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she doesn't care that people she loves have come home. Abigail raised her hand back. She dismounted in the yard and handed her horse to Denny Potts, and stood for a moment in the evening air, looking at the house, the dark timber and the river stone, the porch that needed a new board on the second step, the kitchen window she had looked out of 1,000 times and into which she was now looked back. The same house it had been on the morning she arrived in a supply wagon with a canvas bag and $31, and the particular combination of grief and determination that had gotten her this far, and would, she had no doubt, continue to serve her wherever she went from here. Not the same house, the same walls, the same roof, but a house that had been through something and come out of it with more inside it than it had carried going in. More noise, more laughter, more argument and breakfast and late-night kitchen conversations, and small hands in bread dough, and the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a place where people had decided, collectively and without a formal declaration, to belong to each other. She picked up the pie tin from the shelf just inside the door where she had put it the day she arrived, the dented old thing that had crossed 14 miles of frozen frontier in a canvas bag and been the only continuity between who she was then and who she was now. She turned it over in her hands, just once, then set it back on the shelf. She went into the kitchen. Molly was already pulling out plates. Hazel was at the stove saying something critical about the temperature of something, which meant supper was nearly ready. Silas came in behind Abigail and went to wash his hands at the sink, and the kitchen reorganized itself around both of them, the way a kitchen does when the people in it know each other well enough to move without instruction. "What are we eating?" Silas asked. "Pot roast," Hazel said, "and bread. And there's pie." "There's always pie," Molly said, with great satisfaction. "There's always pie," Abigail agreed. She took her place at the stove. She stirred the pot. She listened to Silas ask Hazel about her day, and Hazel answer with her characteristic mix of precision and editorializing, and she listened to Molly set the table with the sound effects she always added without being aware of it, the small narrations of a child who lived entirely out loud. She listened to the stove and the wind off the mountain, and the settling of the barn, and the distant particular sound of the frontier at evening, that enormous, honest sound of a place that does not adjust itself for human comfort, but which will, if you learn to stand in it without flinching, accommodate you anyway. She stirred the pot. She breathed the warm kitchen air. The woman who had arrived at Iron Ridge Ranch with nothing had built something the size of which could not be counted in acres or ledger entries or wagon runs or legal rulings, though all of those were real. She had built it the only way she had ever known how to build anything. Not in large gestures, not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small ones. A meal made with care, a cup of coffee offered without condition, a door opened, a letter written, a hand held across a kitchen table on an autumn evening while the girls slept and the ranch breathed around them and the mountains stood in the dark exactly as they had always stood. She had built a table large enough for all of them. She had made sure it was always set. She had kept the kitchen warm against the Montana cold, the frontier cold, the specific cold of a world that does not automatically make room for people who look like her and carry what she carried and come from where she came from. And the world had not made room for her. She had made room for herself. One meal at a time, one morning at a time, one stubborn refusal to be smaller than she was. The bread doesn't know it's going to rise, her uncle had said. It just rises anyway. She had never entirely understood it as a child. She understood it now. Abigail, Molly said from the table, is it ready? She looked at the stove, at the pot, at the bread waiting on the rack, at the pie cooling on the counter, at the table set for 4. Yes, she said. She brought the pot to the table. She sat down. Silas sat across from her. Hazel and Molly sat beside them, and the kitchen closed around all 4 of them like something complete, like something that had been searching for its own edges for a long time and had finally found them. Outside, the Montana night was coming in vast and cold and full of stars, the way it always came, the way it would keep coming long after all of them were gone. Enormous and indifferent and breathtakingly beautiful, in the way of things that have no opinion of the lives lived beneath them, and yet somehow, improbably, make those lives feel larger for being witnessed by them. Inside there was lamplight and the smell of something good. Inside there was the sound of a family around a table. Inside there was Abigail Rowan Hawthorne, who had walked 14 miles across a frozen Montana frontier carrying nothing but flour and patience and the specific stubborn refusal to give up on a world that had not yet decided to be kind to her, and who had found, in the most unlikely kitchen in the most unlikely corner of a vast and demanding country, that this, exactly this, was what she had been walking toward all along. She picked up her fork. She was home. The end.